Hi, I'm Chris Page, also known as DC Breaks, and I'm here at the EBS Institute to do a really deep dive into Reese Bass and modern drum and bass sound design. So what I wanted to do with this session was to kind of start looking back at the original Reese Bass, which I'm sure some of you probably know what that is, and kind of look at how you can recreate that sound initially in a kind of basic way, and then really dive in a much more complex way to look at how the sound can be kind of reverse engineered. And then kind of just look at how that sound has developed through drum and bass over the years, how it's kind of developed into a whole kind of subset of different sounds that we kind of call Reese Basses. Don't really sound like the original Reese Bass at all, but essentially consist of distorted, filtered, layered kind of bass sounds. So I'm going to start with a little potted history of the Reese Bass. Has everyone heard of the Reese Bass, or anyone not heard of the Reese Bass? So the Reese Bass is like a classic sound. It came from this record, which was called Just Want Another Chance by an artist called Reese, which was actually a pseudonym of a guy called Kevin Saunderson, who you might have heard of. He was a famous Detroit techno pioneer who, along with Juan Atkins and Derek May, were kind of like, established the sound of Detroit techno back in the 80s. So this record came out in '88. The sound that they were kind of known for was a lot more bright, vocal-driven kind of techno. But he also used to hang out at the Paradise Garage Club in New York City, and DJs like Larry Levan, which had a much deeper, darker sound, kind of influenced him. And so this track is kind of in that spirit, and perhaps that's why he used a different name for it. But what then happened was that on the release, this third A-side, this short edit, had this bass sound clean, and so it got sampled and used a lot in jungle and drum and bass by artists like Ray Keith, famously on the track Terrorist, under one of his pseudonyms, Renegade. And then from there it just kind of became like it's like a kind of almost a staple of the jungle drum and bass sound in the in the early 90s, essentially. So let's have a quick listen to the bass line on the original track and hear how that sounds. So if anyone's ever looked at how to make this sound on YouTube, there's some kind of basic explanations. Kevin Saunderson himself made it on one of these, which is a Casio CZ5000 synth, which you can pick up for a couple £100 if you really like your retro analog gear. But what I really like is I found this quote from him, which I'm going to read out because it kind of speaks to me about how I kind of enjoy making sounds as well. So he says, "I created the Reese Bass from that Casio synth, and drum bass DJs have used it over the years. I'd be getting into the oscillators, but it was trial and error. I didn't know a lot about that kind of stuff, but I knew it affected the way the original patch sounded. You just messed around with every button. So there was no real theory behind it besides experimentation to make something happen differently to what was already there. I can usually tell when I have it right just by how the impact of the sound feels when I play on the keyboard, whether it's a deep Reese bass or any other type of bass." So that kind of is my philosophy when I'm kind of doing sound design and bass design. Kind of if it sounds good, it's good. And when you're kind of starting out, you don't necessarily know what you're doing, and you don't understand necessarily how things like frequency modulation work, or different kinds of oscillators and different types of models of synthesis. But I think you can get really far by just kind of trusting your ears and knowing what kind of sounds good to you and kind of running with that. To kind of create this sound, I'm going to be using, in fact, for the whole session, I'm going to be using a synth called Phase Plant. Has anyone used or seen Phase Plant before in the room? Yeah, and a few nods. So the reason I like Phase Plant is because it's enormously flexible. So I'll spend a little time now just kind of explaining roughly how it works. Essentially, you've got this area on the left here where you have your sound sources, and these can be analog oscillators. It can be a wavetable, it can be samples and noise, and you can kind of group them together, layer them up, run them through envelopes. You can add in distortion filters at this point as well. You can also kind of route pretty much any parameter to anything else within Phase Plant, which we'll look at in more detail later on. So it's hugely flexible on the sound generation side. And then for each of these kind of groups, you can run them into one of three lanes. You can change how the lanes kind of run into each other. And in these lanes, you have the option to add in what's called snap-ins, but effectively they're plugins within this kind of ecosystem of sounds. And so you've got,
Is there a limit of how many plugins you can put in each lane?
Only so much as your CPU will handle. So phase plant is quite CPU intensive, but most of that comes from the number of voices, which we'll kind of get into a bit later on. But there's no real limit, and there's even an effects host called multipass, which I'll just open up now, which is like a multi-band effects processor that sits within it. And so within this, you can also then host, X number of plugins and snap-ins, and kind of route these across different bands. Yeah, it's pretty much unlimited, effectively. And so you can kind of, so for example, if I have a group here, I can run that into lane 1. I could take another layer, run it into lane 2, run all of those into lane 3, and then out through the master. But you can also kind of mix how much of the signal is going into each of these lanes. So it's just enormously flexible. You can pretty much do whatever you want, and that's kind of one of the reasons I like it so much. And then at the bottom, you have an area where you can add modulators. So just to give you an idea of the kinds of things you've got here, you've got envelopes, LFOs, an LFO table. So that's like a bit like a wave table, but as an oscillator, or a modulator, sorry. You've got random things. You can use audio signals from any of these lanes or from your master to control parameters. There's a pitch tracker which does the same thing, but reading the pitch of any of the signals. And there's all sorts of kind of MIDI controls as well. So we'll look later at some of these and how you can use these to kind of add movement and interest to your sounds. And there's even things like MPE as well, which you may know is MIDI polyphonic expression, which we'll look at as well in terms of how you can use to really craft your sounds as well. So that's a kind of quick overview of how it works. The Reese sound essentially was made up of 2 triangle layers, which have been detuned slightly. So if you see here, I don't know if it's, can you see it says 30 and minus 30 cents? And if I just turn off this sine layer and this filter here, the only thing that's happening is effectively a limiter here, and that's just to kind of save the room if it gets too loud. So we're getting effectively beating from having these 2 triangle layers slightly out of phase effectively. So I don't know how much everyone here knows about sort of sound theory, but essentially when you have your oscillators like this slightly out of phase, you're going to get some constructive and deconstructive interference between those 2 signals, and essentially that's causing this beating. So I'm just going to show you what that looks like in this analyzer, which is Noisy's new Vision 4X analyzer, which is great. So let me just, the only problem is it's really big and I don't have a second monitor, so bear with me while I set this up. So this is just the same bass line playing, but just with phase plant. So if we look at that, that's just literally our 2 detuned triangle waves, and we can see it sort of matches this, but we're missing a lot of harmonic information in these spots here, and the harmonics are going kind of much further up the frequency range than in our signal here. Sorry, this one on the left, by the way, is the original sample. And there's all this kind of noise down here, which I'm assuming is noise from the vinyl, where it would have been sampled from the vinyl. And so what we're going to do is try to get closer to this by kind of reverse engineering it in phase plant. So the next thing to do is to add in a sine layer. And so this is going to fill in this harmonic here. So essentially a triangle wave, if you've ever looked at one, is basically a fundamental frequency and then every other harmonic, the odd harmonics going up, getting quieter and quieter through the frequency range. And, oops, excuse me. And so what I'm going to literally do is just create a sine wave, which is just a pure tone to sit in this gap here. So if we press play now, we can see we've kind of filled in that gap and we're getting close to what the original was. If we, you'll notice that the beating is kind of, this is like really filled in, but on this one here, you can see really clearly where that beating's happening. So the brighter it is, that's like the louder it is, and the kind of the pinker is where it's kind of quieter. So we need to kind of think about how we can recreate that as well a little bit, because it's not quite matching up at the moment. But the other thing we need to tackle is all these harmonics up here, which don't exist in the original sample. So all we're going to do is run all of these layers through a low-pass filter. Oop, if the lane goes on, there we go. And this is going to remove these harmonics. And also, because you can see there's a little resonant bump here, this is going to accentuate the volume. It's going to basically turn up the volume of some of these harmonics around the cutoff frequency, which is, let's see, 229 hertz. So going back to how Kevin Saunderson, or Reese, would have made this sound, he wasn't obviously using phase plant, he was using a Casio synth, he was just doing it on feel, and the modelling of the low-pass filter in that particular synth, I don't know what that was, but I can kind of look at it and create the sound and pretty much match it by just tweaking how steep that cutoff is and some of the resonance around the cutoff frequency. So doing that, we then get something that's starting to sound a lot more like the original now. In fact, at first glance, you might think, well, that's pretty much the sound, right? It's pretty close. Let's just go back and compare it to the original one. So if you can see, and the reason I've kind of showing you visually is because it's not necessarily at first, when the first time you listen to it, that easy to hear, but you can see and hear hopefully that this one has a bit of brightness kind of in this area, so there's more harmonics than we've got in our one. So a couple of different ways to approach that. We can either open up the cutoff filter a little bit, allow some of the harmonics through, or we could start to perhaps use some distortion, which is also going to bring up those harmonics. Essentially that's what distortion does, it kind of adds harmonics to a signal. And if you think about a square wave, that's essentially like the ultimate distortion, right? It's just squared off peaks. And if you look at a square wave in an analyzer, you'll see it's pretty much all the frequencies full. And so that kind of adding distortion is getting from that kind of pure sine tone up to a really harmonically rich signal, essentially. Is everyone with me so far? Is this making sense? I don't know what kind of level of sound design and kind of theory people have. So that's your kind of your basic way of making a Reese bass, and it sounds good enough, and that would be absolutely fine. But it's not super authentic, if you like. So what I thought I'd do is kind of look at ways you can kind of take some of those theories forward, and then really dive into how you can recreate that sound in a more accurate way. And that's also a great way to learn about some of these principles of sound design. So I've made a more complex version here, and what I've done is there's two things. First of all, we saw that beating wasn't really happening in the same way. So let me just play through. I'll play through the more advanced one and the sample, so you can kind of compare. So this is the sample. And this is the more advanced kind of complex one. And I'll show you kind of how, you'll see they're pretty much identical now, very, very close. And the way that I've done that, if we dive into phase plant, we saw before that this fundamental frequency was just kind of a straight bar. There was no beating in that. And what was happening was we were getting some interference between the fundamental, which was our detuned triangle waves, and the main sine wave, which was filling in this gap here. So that's like the second harmonic. And so to get that beating, I've run the triangle wave through the triangle layers through a high pass filter to remove the low end and just kind of tweak the cutoff so that it sounds right, and then used the sine wave to kind of fill that in. So that's kind of cleaned up this signal here. And rather than just using the one sine wave, I've then also detuned the sine wave to effectively get the number of oscillations, if you like, of the kind of beatings exactly the same as the original. So we can see the original here, it's like a half cycle, full cycle, half cycle, and that's exactly the same there. And you can see a match across pretty much all the harmonics. It's beating in exactly the same way. So this is I appreciate going into like a really nerdy level of like recreation, but it kind of teaches you a lot about how these sounds are kind of made and why they sound the way they do. But I kind of also was thinking that he probably didn't manually detune lots of layers like in this way, and he may not have even created it in this way, but essentially this is like minus 31 plus 31. It could just be like 30, the same as the other one. So I kind of used that as a starting point to kind of guess that that's what it was. But yeah, literally you could change this a little bit. Let's just change that a little bit, and we'll see that so that's the original. You can now see that it's different. So it's just a question of kind of saying, okay, well, let's just tweak this until it's literally exactly the same. And then I guess there's two strategies you can use to kind of create these harmonics. You can either just pick out like additional sine waves and tune them to fit into these frequency bands. So fundamental frequency, your second harmonic is going to be double. So if I hold my mouse over here and you look at the bottom, you can see it says it's roughly 64 hertz. I think the way to kind of judge the middle is kind of between here and roughly here. So that's roughly yeah, like 60 hertz, this is going to be 120, 180, 240, and so just multiples, whole number, integer multiples is how we get our harmonic series. So to create this harmonic, you literally can say, okay, well, if we look at the original, it's 246 hertz, and so we can just go, okay, well, that's a 1, 2, 3, fourth harmonic, add it in here, and detune it again, the same amount, and then just use the gain to set the volume so that it's the same kind of loudness as the harmonic in the original signal, and kind of do that as high up as you want to go. So that's one way you can kind of do it. The other thing, and this kind of leads us onto how this sound then develops, is to run all of that through some distortion. So I've got this faturator snap in here, which is essentially just drive and fuzz, and you can kind of tweak the color and the mix of it. And just very subtly, I've just mixed in a little bit. And if I maybe just solo that and hit play, again, the screen real estate is kind of the issue here. I'll just add in a bit more distortion so you can see how it kind of colors and adds in further harmonics higher up. So you can see as I kind of drive it harder and harder, it's creating all these kind of crazy harmonics, you know, right up through the frequency spectrum. And I say right up, but this is only kind of in the 2000 kind of range around here. So it's not super high frequency, but it's adding that kind of grit. So that's kind of yeah, kind of how I kind of did it and kind of went right in with it, and yeah, kind of built it up bit by bit. I even added in a bit of noise because the original sample had some kind of a little bit of fuzz on it, a little bit of noise, presumably could have been noise from being encoded to like an MP3, or it could have been just you know, fuzz from if it was sampled from a vinyl, which is likely, or some tapes, you know, if it was recorded to tape, I don't know. You can't, at this point, you can kind of, you know, you're getting pretty nerdy. But essentially, that's kind of how you can kind of do it in a much more detailed way if you want to, and if you don't want to go out and buy a Casio CZ5000. So, but that's not what happened, of course. People didn't sit here with Faceplant in the early 90s and kind of rebuild the sound. They just sampled it. And actually, if we go in now and look at the Terrorist bass sample, which is a famous jungle bass line, we can actually see and kind of almost prove, if you like, that that's what happened. So let's go to these guys. Just need to turn these on. I'm just going to turn all these off because Faceplant is a real drain. And turn this guy on here. Oops. This mouse is a little... There we go. So, so this is actually a simpler version. It's not that. Oh no, it's not. Yeah, it's pretty detailed. So let's look at the Terrace bass and compare that. So it's a different bass line, but essentially it's the same sound. And so if we look at how the beating is happening in the harmonics on the Terrace sample, it's got this kind of weird little like glitches in it. And that tells me that what he's done is he's sampled the first bass note and just looped it in probably in like an Akai sampler or something. The other clue is that if you look at the difference between the notes, you can see that effectively in the original one, it's like this is the sample, then he's pitched it down, so it has pretty much the same sonic footprint, if you like, just a lower note held for longer, and then another note, same kind of thing. And depending on, you know, when you're triggering the sample higher or lower on the keyboard, it's either going to play through that sample faster or slower. And so if it's a lower note, it's going to take longer to get to the loop point, which is here. If it's a higher note, it's going to loop around more quickly. And so the speed of these beatings and where this kind of loop point is, it just depends on what notes has been played in. So when I'm synthesizing this sound, that's obviously not happening. And so there's quite a lot of difference between, for example, this second note and this second note. So that kind of just shows us that that was kind of, I mean, it was kind of obviously the case, but that's kind of how that sound got used. And we can kind of play around with that as well ourselves if we wanted to do that. So I've kind of just run off this bass line here essentially. So that's kind of my recreation sampled. And then you can chuck it into a sampler. So if I open up the Logic sampler here, just select this here. So this is that full bass line, but I'm only really interested in this first note. And I've created a loop on that first note. And probably what also happened was that the sample probably had some of that vinyl noise on it, that crackle, and with it being also then going to be, you know, put onto a record. And I guess in terms of maintaining the sound quality, probably Ray Keith decided, well, I'm going to like low pass filter this again, just to remove any of the kind of the high noise that might have been there from recording from the vinyl, just to kind of clean it up and fatten it up. So again, we can kind of play around with that ourselves, run this, in this case, through a low pass filter, just a 12 dB one with a bit of resonance and drive, and bring the cutoff down. And that again is kind of almost accentuating some of those harmonics that we had, sort of the third and fourth harmonic in that original sound. So I'll turn the filter off, and hopefully if it's loud enough you can kind of hear the difference between the two, and also see how this kind of beating affects the kind of the vibe of the sound by kind of whether it's like, you know, going quickly or slowly. So if I play the actual Reese Bass, you see when it's on a higher note it's going through, and it's kind of oscillating more quickly. Let's add this filter, and that kind of gives it that droniness, that kind of rich, like it's quite different. Up here it's a bit like slightly nasal and a bit, and here it's like really fat and like in the club it's just like shaking everybody. So that's kind of how the sound has started to progress and become even more kind of rich and kind of even, even kind of better essentially. So just by way of comparison, then we can just solo the two together. Just need to turn this guy back on. We can see that again in our sampler, analyzer. And so we get a much more accurate, it's not perfect, but it's pretty much, to all intents and purposes, an accurate representation of that resampled bass. I hope you enjoyed that session. If you want to see more videos like this, just head over to the DBS Institute YouTube channel now.